He was a child betrayed by the very people meant to protect him. A young prince who watched his kingdom burn from the hands of the powerful. And yet, he rose, not as a mere ruler, but as a Tsar feared across the land. His name, Ivan IV, known to history as Ivan the Terrible, a man who united Russia through terror, blood, and ambition, and left a legacy that would haunt the nation for centuries. This is the story of power, paranoia, and a throne built on fear. In the early 16th century, the land we now call Russia was a patchwork of principalities, a people vast and scattered, stretching from the forests of the north to the steppes of the south, but lacking unity. For centuries, these lands had lived under the shadow of the Mongols, paying tribute to the Golden Horde, their rulers more vassals than sovereigns. Yet change was stirring. A new power was rising, and its center was Moscow. The scene fades to an image of the Kremlin walls taking shape. Moscow had slowly grown from a wooden fortress into the heart of a new political force. Under Ivan III, known as Ivan the Great, the Mongol yoke had been thrown off. His successors consolidated power, expanding territory, and weaving together the fractured Russian lands. By the early 1500s, Moscow was no longer just another principality. It was the beating heart of a new state. A state with ambitions. A shift in tone, slower, darker, but the state, while rising, was fragile. Its rulers depended heavily on the boyars, the great noble families who owned vast lands and commanded armies of their own. These boyars were not loyal servants of a king. They were rivals, jealous, greedy, and brutal. The throne of Moscow was theirs to manipulate, and into this dangerous world, in 1530, a child was born. His name was Ivan. Cut to candlelight over a cradle, whispers of court intrigue. Ivan was the grandson of Ivan the Great, heir to a legacy of defiance against the Mongols, yet also heir to a kingdom still fractured by ambition and betrayal. His father, Vasily III, died when Ivan was just 3 years old. His mother, Elena Glinskaya, became regent. But in the poisonous halls of Moscow, power never rested long in one pair of hands. Build tension. In 1538, when Ivan was only 8, his mother died suddenly. Some say poisoned. With both parents gone, the child was left to the mercy of the boyars. Mercy, however, was not in their nature. In the Kremlin's cold corridors, young Ivan watched as nobles schemed, robbed the treasury, beat servants, and humiliated him. The boy who should have been nurtured as the future ruler of Russia grew up neglected, abused, and taught a cruel lesson. Power belonged not to the weak, but to those who seized it without pity. Scene. Slow zoom into young Ivan's face. As he wandered the Kremlin, ignored and hungry, Ivan learned to despise the nobility. He watched their arrogance, their cruelty, and their disdain for him. In secret, he fed that hatred. He also fed his imagination. The boy turned to books, reading chronicles of Rome and Byzantium, of mighty rulers who bent nations to their will. And so, in the shadows of a troubled childhood, Ivan dreamed of becoming not just a prince, but something greater. A ruler feared, obeyed, and beyond the reach of the boyars' games. Pause for effect. The child who felt powerless would one day make all of Russia tremble. But first, he had to seize the crown. And he would seize it in a way no Russian ruler before him had dared. On a cold January day in 1547, the bells of Moscow rang louder than ever before. Inside the great cathedral of the Dormition, a solemn ceremony was underway. At just 16 years old, Ivan, grandson of Ivan the Great, was about to transform Russian history. Unlike his forefathers, who called themselves Grand Princes of Moscow, Ivan would take a new title. A title borrowed from the Byzantine emperors, a title meant to echo the glory of Rome itself. He crowned himself Tsar of all Rus. The scene, golden icons, chants of priests, the glitter of the Orthodox crown placed upon his head. This was not just a coronation. It was a declaration. By calling himself Tsar, a word derived from Caesar, Ivan was claiming absolute power. He was no longer just first among equals. He was the chosen ruler, ordained by God, and placed above the boyars who had once humiliated him. For the first time in history, Russia had a Tsar, a shift to lighter tone, hopeful. At first, the young Tsar showed promise. Guided by his beloved wife, Anastasia Romanovna, Ivan worked to reform his realm. He ordered a new legal code, the Sudebnik of 1550, tightening justice and curbing corruption. He summoned the first Zemsky Sobor, an assembly that gave voice to different classes of Russian society. He reorganized the army, creating the streltsy, the first permanent firearm, equipped force in Russian history. For a brief moment, it seemed Russia had found a ruler who would strengthen the state, modernize its laws, and expand its horizons. A scene cavalry galloping across snowy plains. In 1552, Ivan set his sights eastward, on the Khanate of Kazan, once a bastion of the Mongol legacy. After a fierce campaign, his armies stormed the city, tearing down its walls and raising the cross above its mosques. The victory was celebrated as a holy war, a triumph of orthodoxy over Islam. But it was also a strategic masterstroke. With Kazan subdued, Russia gained access to the rich Volga River, the gateway to trade and conquest. A beat, then building excitement. 2 years later, Ivan's banners flew over Astrakhan, at the mouth of the Volga. The Caspian Sea was now open to Russian trade. Soon, explorers pushed beyond the Urals into the vast wilderness of Siberia, planting the seeds of an empire that would one day stretch across 11 time zones. Under Ivan, Russia was no longer a fractured principality. It was becoming a continental power. A shift tone, darker foreshadowing. And yet, while Ivan's realm expanded, so did the shadows in his heart. Those who knew him saw two men within the same crown. One, the reformer, the visionary, the conqueror of Kazan. The other, the wounded child, still haunted by betrayal and loss, quick to anger, and consumed by suspicion. Tsar Anastasia comforted Ivan by candlelight. For a time, his wife Anastasia tempered his darker impulses. She was gentle where he was harsh, steady where he was volatile, but their happiness would not last. In 1560, Anastasia fell gravely ill. Ivan was inconsolable. When she died, he was convinced it was no natural death. He accused the boyars of poisoning her. And with her death, the balance within the Tsar was shattered. The reformer gave way to the tyrant. The promise of his early reign began to rot into fear, blood, and terror. Pause, voice low and ominous. The Tsar who crowned himself as Caesar would soon behave like one of Rome's darkest emperors. His enemies would not just be defeated, they would be annihilated. In the wake of Anastasia's death, Moscow felt a change. The man who had once been hailed as a reformer now seemed possessed by rage. Ivan was convinced his beloved wife had been murdered, poisoned by the boyars. The nobles who had once tormented him as a child were now his enemies once more. He trusted no one. Not the church, not his counselors, not even his closest kin. Out of grief grew suspicion. Out of suspicion, cruelty. Seamy shadowed corridors, the Kremlin lit by flickering torchlight. In 1564, in a shocking act of theater, Ivan abandoned his throne. He fled Moscow, leaving behind a letter that accused the boyars and clergy of treason. Panic spread across the city. Without the Tsar, the realm could collapse. The boyars pleaded for his return, and return he did, but on his terms. Ivan demanded absolute freedom to punish whom he pleased, to rule without restraint. His price was accepted, and thus a new order was born, the Oprichnina. Scene shifts, black riders thundering through the snow, clad in ominous uniforms. The Oprichnina was unlike anything Russia had seen. Ivan carved the realm in two, one part under traditional administration, the other his personal domain, ruled directly by him. To enforce his will, he created a new force, the Oprichniki. Dressed in black, riding black horses, they bore the severed heads of dogs and brooms upon their saddles. Symbols of their mission to sniff out treachery and to sweep away Ivan's enemies. Voice sharpens. These Oprichniki became a terror. They tortured, executed, and confiscated lands. They stormed estates, slaughtering entire noble families. Their cruelty did not stop at the boyars. Common people, merchants, even clergy fell victim. The mere whisper of disloyalty was enough to bring the executioner's axe. Villages were burned. Tens of thousands were killed. Russia trembled under the shadow of its own Tsar. A scene, frozen streets of Novgorod, church bells tolling. Nowhere was this terror more brutal than in Novgorod. Ivan believed the city planned to defect to Lithuania. His rage was merciless. In 1570, he led his Oprichniki into the city. For weeks, they unleashed a nightmare. Monks drowned in icy rivers. Families burned alive. Corpses piled in the snow. Some historians estimate that more than 10 Zalazan perished. It was not war. It was annihilation. A city punished for suspicion alone. Pause, voice quiet, but now. Ivan's paranoia knew no limits. He saw conspiracies everywhere. He ordered public executions in Moscow, making an example of supposed traitors. Torture chambers echoed beneath the Kremlin. The air itself seemed poisoned with fear. The boy who had been powerless was now wielding power with vengeance. And no one, not noble, not peasant, not priest, was safe. Seeing Ivan pacing alone, clutching a cross. And yet within this darkness was contradiction. Ivan was deeply religious. He prayed, confessed, built churches, and saw himself as God's chosen ruler. But he also believed he was God's avenger, punishing a sinful nation. To him, cruelty was not madness, it was justice. Voice rises, dramatic. The Tsar, who had once united Russia, was now tearing it apart. His obsession with control weakened the economy, drained the treasury, and filled the land with despair. Even his foreign wars turned sour. The Livonian War, begun with hope of access to the Baltic Sea, dragged on into disaster. Armies starved, cities fell. Enemies pressed Russia on every border. But Ivan was blind to failure. All he saw were traitors. A scene fades to black, narrator's tone heavy. By the 1570s, Ivan the Terrible had become the very thing he once hated, a tyrant who ruled through fear, betrayal, and blood. Russia was a nation under siege, not from outsiders, but from its own ruler. The 1560s and 70s were years of unrelenting bloodshed. The Oprichnina had spread fear across the land, but instead of strengthening Russia, it weakened it. Farms were abandoned. Towns lay in ruins. Trade routes collapsed. Families fled from the Black Riders rather than from foreign invaders. Ivan's dream of absolute control was devouring the very foundation of his realm. Even as he struck down his enemies, betrayal, real or imagined, haunted him at every turn. Seen weary peasants trudging through the snow, fields left barren. Among the nobles, whispers spread. Some sought protection abroad. Others plotted in secret. But even the common folk began to despair of their Tsar. They saw in him not the father of the nation, but the executioner of it. Where once loyalty had united the people under the double-headed eagle of Moscow, now only silence and terror remained. And yet Ivan could not see that fear was not loyalty. He mistook trembling for obedience. Shift to foreign battlefields, drums of war. While Russia bled within, Ivan sought glory without. The Livonian War, launched in 1558, was meant to give Russia access to the Baltic Sea. Control of the Baltic would bring trade, wealth, and recognition as a European power. At first, Ivan's armies advanced. But soon the tide turned. Sweden, Poland, and Lithuania united against him. His troops, starving and underfunded, collapsed before seasoned European forces. Villages burned, not by Russians, but by foreign soldiers sweeping into once secure lands. The dream of the Baltic slipped away. A pause, narrator lowers voice. To Ivan, failure was never his fault. It was treason. He blamed the boyars, the generals, the clergy. He even accused entire cities of betrayal. The more he lost abroad, the more ferociously he punished at home. His empire was caught in a spiral of defeat and repression. Seen, candlelit chamber, Ivan in a furious rage. And then came the moment that would haunt his legacy forever. In 1581, in a fit of uncontrollable fury, Ivan struck his eldest son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich. Accounts differ on the cause. Some say a quarrel over the treatment of the Tsar's pregnant daughter. In law, others claim it was a dispute over policy. What is certain is that Ivan's staff struck his son's head. The young man collapsed, blood pouring from his wound. He died days later. The Tsar, realizing what he had done, was said to have cradled his son's body, weeping uncontrollably, screaming at God for forgiveness. But forgiveness never came. A scene. Iconic painting of Ivan clutching his dying son, his eyes wild with horror. With that single blow, Ivan had destroyed his dynasty's future. His son was not only his heir, but the one man capable of continuing the line with strength. In his paranoia and rage, the Tsar had murdered his own blood, leaving Russia vulnerable to a crisis of succession. Even his Oprichniki could not protect him from the consequences of his own hand. A shift tone, simmering sense of betrayal everywhere. By now, Russia's nobles no longer saw Ivan as a ruler to be obeyed, but as a storm to be endured. They feared him, but they did not love him. The common people prayed not for his long life, but for his death. And yet, betrayal cut both ways. Ivan believed that all of Russia had betrayed him, the boyars, the clergy, the generals, even his own family. In his mind, he stood alone against a treacherous nation. A voice sharp, final in reality, it was the other way around. The Tsar had betrayed Russia. In his quest to crush treason, he became the greatest traitor of all, betraying the trust of his people, the stability of his realm, and the legacy of his own dynasty. A scene fades to silence. Black screen. When Ivan finally looked into the mirror of his reign, he no longer saw a conqueror or reformer. He saw a man surrounded by ashes, corpses, and fear. Russia was scarred, and Ivan was left with only one thing, the shadow of his own legacy. In March of 1584, Ivan sat at a chessboard in the Kremlin. His beard had grown long and gray, his body weakened by years of illness and paranoia. The once fiery Tsar, conqueror of Kazan and terror of Novgorod, was but a shadow of the man who had once struck fear into Europe. As he leaned over the board, he collapsed suddenly. Within hours, Ivan IV, known to history as Ivan the Terrible, was dead. He was 53 years old. The scene Moscow bells tolling, crowds gathering in silence. His death marked the end of an era soaked in blood and fear, yet one that reshaped Russia forever. Ivan left behind a nation both broken and bound. Broken, because his violence had devastated cities, farms, and families. Broken, because his purges had left the nobility hollowed out, his armies weakened, and his people scarred by terror. But bound, because he had done what no ruler before him had dared. He had centralized power. He had forged the Tsardom of Russia, uniting its vast territories under the crown and placing the monarch beyond challenge. A scene maps shifting, showing Russia's expansion under Ivan. Under his rule, Russia expanded eastward, seizing Kazan, Astrakhan, and opening the road to Siberia. His vision of empire pushed the borders outward and planted the seeds of a state that would one day stretch across half the globe. Yet for all his conquests, Ivan's grip on the West faltered. His dream of reaching the Baltic was shattered. His wars left the treasury empty, his armies exhausted, and his people wary. A shift tone, somber, perhaps his greatest legacy was not land, but fear. The Oprichnina, his secret police, set a precedent for the use of terror as a tool of rule in Russia. From the Oprichniki in black cloaks to later secret services under Tsars and commissars, the shadow of Ivan's methods would haunt Russian governance for centuries. The idea that order must come through fear began with him. Scene, painting of Ivan clutching his dying son, contrasted with his coronation. But Ivan's legacy was also deeply personal. By killing his heir, he plunged Russia into a succession crisis. His surviving son, Fyodor, was weak and childless. Within 2 decades, the dynasty would collapse, plunging Russia into the time of troubles, a period of famine, civil war, and foreign invasion. The seeds of chaos were sown by Ivan himself. Pause, reflective tone. History remembers him by his epithet Grozny, Ivan Grozny. Translated, it means not terrible, in the modern sense, but awe-inspiring, formidable, even dreadful. To his subjects, he was a man to be feared. To his enemies, he was a man to be reckoned with. To future rulers, he was both a warning and a model, a Tsar who had united the land, but fractured the soul of his people. A scene aerial shot of the Kremlin, fading into the vast Russian landscape. Centuries later, Ivan the Terrible remains a paradox. Was he a tyrant, driven by paranoia who drenched his realm in blood? Or was he a visionary, who transformed a scattered principality into a centralized state, laying the foundation of empire? Perhaps he was both. A man of brilliance and madness, a ruler who rose from a childhood of humiliation to dominate his land. A Tsar who left behind a Russia scarred by terror, yet forever changed. Final pause, narrator solemn. In the end, Ivan IV was neither saint nor simple villain. He was the first Tsar of Russia, and in his terrible shadow, the future of Russia was born. Ivan IV, the first Tsar of Russia, ruled with a hand of iron and a heart shadowed by fear. He expanded the realm, centralized power, and left his enemies trembling. But he also left a trail of blood, broken families, and a dynasty on the brink of collapse. Centuries later, historians still debate him. Tyrant or visionary, monster or nation builder. One thing is certain, his reign changed Russia forever. The echoes of Ivan the Terrible's terror and ambition can still be felt in the corridors of power, in the stories of his people, and in the very soul of the nation he both forged and scarred.